When you ask people in Moorton what they do for a living, it isn't often you get the answer, "I'm a Bigfoot hunter." I suppose in fairness, that wasn't really John's title. He'd probably have preferred something more highfalutin like cryptozoologist to reflect the fact that he took this stuff seriously and had actual proper qualifications. Not that they related to his monster hunting, but still. Either way, if you asked anyone in town what John did for a living, cryptozoologist would never reach their lips. "Isn't he the fella that goes hunting Bigfoot?" would be a much more likely thing to hear them say. For John, Moorton was a Venus flytrap. He'd literally call it that whenever he came back. I suppose in a way he had a point. Many people who grow up in small towns like ours never quite manage to leave. They're born here, they go to school here, they build up relationships and lay down roots that are difficult to sever. Sometimes those people get jobs in town, they start businesses, and they fall in love with other people who've lived here all their lives. Small towns offer the important 3 Fs: familiarity, family, and friends. 3 Fs that are still there anytime you leave and come back. These things remain behind, they tempt you back, and sometimes they close over you and keep you there, just like a Venus flytrap. I've honestly lost count of the number of people who have left Moorton with big dreams of making it in the city, or who've moved away, sometimes for years, only to be drawn back by the heavy anchors of their family and friends. All too often they come back for a visit and never leave again. John refused to be stuck and tended to come and go. He'd bob into town around once every 6 months, just long enough to make the local paper about his latest adventure, and then he'd be off on his travels again, hunting some beast or other, and hoping against hope that one day he'd find the evidence that would make all of this supposed nonsense legitimate. The one bit of proof that would knock the crypto off of his zoology. The last time I saw him, John showed me something that he insisted was the real deal. A recording that he said was finally a piece of genuine proof. That was the last time I saw him. The problem is, that was the last time anyone saw him. He disappeared about a week later. The supposed evidence that he showed me was a recording from a trail cam that he had set up during his most recent visit to North America. The camera, one of 10 he had left filming in patches of wilderness, was activated by movement and should have picked up any creature that happened to stroll past it. In practice, the cameras were effective. Over the years, he had shown me footage of deer, moose, bears, and even the back end of one slightly camera-shy mountain lion. What he had never managed to show me was a mystery primate walking upright and answering to the name Sasquatch. Even the footage he showed me on that occasion, footage that he wholeheartedly believed was real, showed nothing but a distinct clatter and crack of broken branches, movement in the bushes, and an indistinct shape passing amongst and between them. The images were hardly conclusive and to my untrained eye looked like an ink blot snuffling through the bracken. For all I knew, it could have been a deer, a bear, or a wild boar. Luckily, it was not the image alone that John was hanging his hopes upon. Having shown me the blurred and mucky-looking images, he reinforced his point with photographs. Images of casts he had taken of footprints found at the scene. These, I must admit, were far more intriguing. In our many conversations on the subjects of cryptids and particularly large unknown primates like yetis, Bigfoot and yowies, John had explained how most supposed footprints of these creatures were easily dismissed as fakes. One, he showed me in detail, was a print in the snow supposedly made by a yeti. He happily pointed out that in the images, the different parts of the print were at different consistencies and arrangements, with some parts being deeper and others more shallow. This, he said, was simply the track of a mountain goat that had then melted, thawed and refrozen multiple times to appear elongated.
It can't be an ape track,
he said, as if he was a world authority on the subject.
Because an animal that large and heavy would make a much deeper impression. Primates tend to distribute weight between their heels at the outside pad of the ball of the foot. If a primate made this print, it would be virtually floating. The indent isn't heavy enough.
He also pointed out that the other prints were far too close to this one.
If we look at the size of the print and measure the distance between that and the next print, it really does not look like a bipedal gait. The size of the print suggests a very big animal, but the prints are so close together that the stride would be tiny, so either we have a yeti doing ballet, or a big-footed dwarf like a hobbit stalking the mountains of Tibet, or, far more likely, it's a goat.
The funny thing about John and his obsession with cryptids was how dismissive he was about them. When he was away, people would talk about John as if he was delusional, part of the tinfoil hat brigade who believed in fairies and that politicians were really lizard people. In reality, nothing could have been further from the truth. I remember once watching him speak at a respected university. He was on a panel invited to speak about mythological creatures and had spent 15 minutes listening to another academic talk about the cave-dwelling giants that had been spotted living in the tunnels under Malta. According to this boffin, the creatures were 12 feet tall, covered in long red hair, and heavily muscled. They skulked around in the cave systems and had been seen by many witnesses. John tore him to pieces. How, he said, could an animal that large live down there with no prey species to feed on? What are they doing eating the rocks? Where is there any other example of an animal that size living in a subterranean environment? Why does it have red hair when most cave-dwelling animals have lost their pigment? How does it see, and in the depth where it is alleged to dwell, how does it access fresh, clean water? The other academic was stunned. Contrary to the usual Moorton rumours and mischaracterizations, John was a serious scientist. Most of his work on cryptids involved dispelling the myths, holding the flimsy evidence up to rigorous scientific scrutiny, and often dismantling them. John was not someone who wanted to believe in cryptids. He was someone who wanted proof that they existed. Belief, he would often say, had nothing to do with it. It was the cynicism that John displayed toward other supposed encounters with fabled beasts that made me trust his findings more. John was no fool. If he said he had evidence, then odds were he had something solid. So it was with the prints. He showed me, with the help of diagrams and computer reconstructions, right there in the pub in Moorton, how the weight distribution suggested by these prints, the depth of the indents, and the toe placement were entirely consistent with a large primate-like gorilla or a chimpanzee. He also played me the audio. The sound was like a mix of calls, somewhere between a bellowing roar and a screech.
"That,"
said John triumphantly,
"is the sound of a Bigfoot. The call is almost identical to other recordings made by people who have claimed to see the creature. It's him, I'm telling you, it's him."
To my untrained ear, it certainly sounded like an ape, like something you would hear in the monkey house at the zoo, but it was not coming from the zoo. It was coming from a dark space, somewhere between the trees, a space that John was determined to explore. What he found there, we will never know, but I do know a man who has a theory. Around 6 months ago, I was contacted by a man named James Bellamy, a keen primatologist with a sideline in cryptozoology. James, it turned out, was part of a chain of suggested contacts left behind by John. John had asked that if anything were to happen to him, any footage or notes that were recovered be sent on to James. James, in turn, had been asked if he were ever given such footage to contact me. Not because I could offer any insight. I honestly know very little about animals, and certainly couldn't tell you the difference between a baboon and a bonobo on the first try. John was constantly picking me up for calling chimps and orangutans monkeys when apparently they were not. No, John had not gotten word to me for my insight, but rather because I was his friend and he believed I deserved some kind of closure. As it turned out, the closure I received was far from reassuring. I met James at the very same pub where months earlier, John had played the strange clip to me. James played me something similar.
"This,"
he began,
"was filmed on a camera set up personally by John around 5 minutes before the sounds you hear. If we rewind the tape back, we see night vision shots of John erecting the camera and checking the audio and visual levels. He then goes off, out of shot, and, well, that's the last we see of him. The last anyone sees of him. About 5 minutes after that, there is scratching through the foliage somewhere to the left of the camera shot, and the same wild calls that John recorded previously. They are longer and more stretched out on these recordings. Listen."
James played a snippet of the sound. At first, there was the distinct impression of a commotion, snapping twigs and the echo of larger branches breaking as something large moved through the undergrowth. Then that awful wailing. When I had first heard that sound, I had been excited, genuinely thrilled for John that he might finally get what he was after. Hearing it that second time, I felt none of that excited. Instead, I felt sick at the thought of my friend. alone in the forest with a thing large enough and aggressive enough to make those sounds. James stopped the recording and then played me 2 other clips. They were recordings, he said, of gorillas and of chimpanzees taken in the wild. Both sounded eerily similar to the call on the first clip.
That the call was made by a large primate, I have no doubt,
said James conclusively.
Unfortunately, that's what worries me. The calls you just heard were made by the dominant males of each species right before they were ready to mate. Now that period usually corresponds to increased levels of aggression and territorial behavior. The way I see it, there are 2 possibilities. It's possible that John intruded onto this thing's territory and met with the consequences of being confronted by an angry wild animal. The problem with that theory is that his body has not been recovered. If he had been maimed or killed, then his body should have been found in the area.
What's the alternative? I asked, confused.
Well, it's like I told you. Those sounds come before the thing is ready to mate. Most of the great ape species display something called sexual dimorphism, where the female is far smaller in terms of height, weight, and muscle mass than the male. If John is still alive, if he was dragged away, abducted, and taken by whatever this thing is and to wherever it makes its home, then it could be a case of mistaken identity. It almost doesn't bear thinking about, but I dread to consider what might be going through now, or what a thing like that might try to do to him.
James was right. It doesn't bear thinking about, and most of the time I really do try not to.